We good, Raleigh? Well, good evening then, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's debate. I want to thank you all very much for coming. We are a crowd that is lacking perhaps in numbers, but not in enthusiasm and zeal. If you brought your therapy cat this evening, please be advised there might be sudden loud exchanges. As a matter of fact, I have brought boxing gloves for both of our speakers, and we've advertised they're going to be going 5 rounds. No, really, I put 20 bucks on Mike to beat Richard here in the fourth. Forgive me. Jokes aside, this is going to be a lively presentation, so we do ask that you refrain from any applause or other interruption during the middle of the event. We're going to have a lengthy Q&A session during which you are welcome to query our speakers and to voice your own views. Oh, and ladies, please remove your hats. The Socratic Club organizes religious debates and dialogues between scholars to benefit the OSU students and OSU community. The club was founded in 1941 in Oxford, and C.S. Lewis served as its first president. Our mission is to provide an open forum for the discussion of religion in general and Christianity in particular. Socratic Club is enjoying our 14th year of service to students at OSU, and at the risk of sounding cliche, next fall, we'll be back. I also want you to know that debates are not the only thing that we do. We have a book club that meets each Tuesday in the Memorial Union in the Talisman Room, and we are right now studying Tim Keller's book, Making Sense of God. It's one of his brand new books. We also have a very small library in the same room, and you are welcome to check out books from that library, to peruse them at your leisure. Some of them are by our previous speakers or are related to our previous topics. And believe it or not, Socratic Club is part of the 21st century, even though our website desperately needs to be updated. You can follow us on Facebook or Twitter. You can also sign up for our email list in the lobby if you'd like to hear about future debates or if you'd like to become a member. We have a couple members who are in attendance. Actually, we have a members pool right over here. So at the end of the night, if you have any questions for them, you're welcome to find one of our Socratics. Now, tonight's event is going to have 4 portions. These speakers will begin with their construction speech. Each speaker will have about 20 minutes to build their case. Then we'll have a short rebuttal by each speaker, in which they will be responding to the arguments that were made by their opponent and also strengthening their own case. Thirdly, they're going to have a lengthy dialogue section in which they will query one another and sort of probe for weaknesses and also try and demonstrate their own strengths. Fourthly, we're going to have about a half hour for Q&A. We'll have a wonderful chance for you to ask questions. Maybe there's a question that you've been waiting to ask the entire time, and no one will have talked about it, and you'll have that wonderful opportunity to say what's on your mind. And then in the closing moments of our event, we'll have statements from our speakers wrapping up what they've said and reminding you of the important talking points. Sound good?
Yes.
Good. Our first speaker tonight then is Dr. Michael Gurney, who is a past master of the Socratic podium. Dr. Gurney is professor of theology, philosophy at Multnomah University. He holds a PhD in theology from Aberdeen University, Scotland. Very proud of that. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gurney.
Make sure to turn on all the technology here. Can you hear me at the back okay? Yes. Okay, good. All right, well, good evening. Thank you for being here, and thank you for Richard for willing to come and debate. I hope that our debate can be substantive and enlightening and educational. Frankly, I watched too many debates where it was more kind of rhetorical and I'm hoping we can really dig into some pretty meaty stuff. So I'm going to be arguing for the affirmative that Jesus was and is the Son of God. In arguing for the affirmative, I want to make 4 specific points. First, Jesus was and is a real historical person. Secondly, this historical Jesus was believed by early Christians to be the Son of God, and this belief became further developed and codified in the creeds of traditional orthodoxy in terms of Jesus being both fully God and fully man, what I call the traditional Orthodox hypothesis. 3, these 2 suppositions, the historical Jesus is real and Jesus is the Son of God, can be reasonably inferred from the New Testament by means of critical historical analysis. And then 4th, confirmation of the traditional Orthodox hypothesis can be rationally justified by the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. So my focus in this opening argument, and I think Richard would agree with me, at least I think he will, that looking at the historicity of Jesus is a fairly complicated, the historical studies are just all over the place. There's a plethora of views, and it's hard to even categorize some of the views that are out there. So what I'm going to try to do is to present in my opening argument really 2 points. First, to articulate what I take to be a New Testament affirmation of Jesus as the Son of God, and what that means exactly, and that the fact that it originates from the promise of the Hebrew Scriptures rather than from Hellenistic pagan ideas. And then secondly, in brief, because our primary focus is on the question, is Jesus the Son of God? But I think it's important that we bring in the discussion about the resurrection, because in my view, the bodily resurrection of Jesus provides historical confirmation for the traditional Orthodox hypothesis. In fact, I hope to show you that from the New Testament itself. So let me try to synthesize a lot of material in a very short amount of time. And I'll be very narrow in my focus. First with the term Son of God. The term occurs about 124 times in the New Testament. Of that 124 times, about 17 are found in Paul's writings, so it's just kind of interesting. In fact, Paul shows a preference for the Greek word kurios, or often translated as Lord, rather than Son of God. But he does mention it 17 times. Second interesting point is that we find this term Son of God, or the Hebrew B'nai Elohim, in the Old Testament, used in 3 different ways. First, it's used in reference to angels, in Genesis 6 and Job 1. Secondly, in reference to Israel, probably a key verse here would be Exodus 4:22. But probably the most prominent would be in reference to a king, and specifically a Davidic king, a descendant of David. And 3 key passages there would be 2 Samuel 7, Psalm 2, and Psalm 89. Now, there's also, interestingly, and I don't probably won't have time to get into this, but frankly, I'm not sure that how much of a case one can make. But there is some reference in the Dead Sea Scrolls. 4Q246, for example, mentions it somewhat ambiguous and questionable. Now, in terms of the gospel references, let me just cite, I think, 4 examples. First, in Mark's gospel, and most scholars believe that Mark, it was called Markan priority, that Mark is probably the earliest of the 4 gospels. I think they're probably right on that. And it's interesting how Mark begins his gospel and uses the term Son of God to introduce Jesus. The beginning of the gospel is the Son of God. And interestingly, at the end of his gospel, or near the end of his gospel, he has Jesus before the high priest, and the high priest is interrogating him in Mark chapter 14, verse 61, and he asks Jesus, "Are you the Son of the Blessed One?" To which Jesus answers yes, and of course, this is to elicit the charge of blasphemy. Another interesting area where we find this term Son of God is found in the birth narratives, particularly Luke's account. In Luke chapter 1, verses 31 to 35. And it's interesting, when you read the birth narrative there by Luke, it makes a direct and explicit link to Jesus being the son of David. And it uses that kind of language. Now, there are a lot of scholars have challenged the birth narratives, but it's interesting that it raises the question about where did this idea come from. In fact, Raymond Brown, a prominent New Testament scholar, wrote a book about this thick on the birth of the Messiah. He says this, quote, "In short, there is no clear example of virginal conception in world or pagan religions that plausibly could have given first century Jewish Christians the idea of the virginal conception of Jesus." And I think that's a very significant detail. Another reference in the Gospels we find is reference to Jesus' baptism, which is referenced in all 4 Gospels. And of course, in the baptism, we have John the Baptist baptizing Jesus, and a voice coming out of heaven declaring that this is my beloved Son. Thiessen and Mertz, in their book on the historical Jesus, said that Jesus is considered by most scholars or the baptism of Jesus is considered a basic historical fact. But once again, I think clearly, at the very least, what this tells us is that John's message and Jesus' identity as the Son of God has a direct connection. And then finally in the Gospels, one other place I would appeal to is Peter's confession, found in Mark chapter 8 and Matthew chapter 16. Now, Mark's account of it, he refers to Peter's confession as Jesus is the Christ. In Matthew's account, he adds to that the Son of God. What's also interesting to note, in that passage, or in those passages, the disciples themselves evince a lot of confusion when Jesus tells them not to tell anyone that he's the Messiah, and then he tells them he needs to suffer and die. Peter rebukes him, which I think tells us that the disciples themselves are not clear on what exactly the significance of Jesus being the Son of God. Now, most scholars, I think most New Testament scholars across the board, I think agree, one of the few things they probably agree on, is that the epistles themselves are probably earlier and more reliable. And so I want to appeal to three particular epistles, three passages in the epistles. First, Romans chapter 1, and let me just read this in verses 3 through 4. Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophet in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, who is descended from David, according to the flesh, and declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness, by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Now, a couple of interesting things to note about this passage. First, most scholars date Romans around between 55 to 58. And a number of scholars, a lot of scholars believe that this statement includes a pre-Pauline creed. And so this is likely something that was believed and affirmed probably within 20 years of Jesus' life. In Philippians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul, once again, quotes what appears to be an early creed or hymn. Let me quote this: "Who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." Now, once again, a lot of scholars date the book of Philippians in the early 60s, not 1960s, just to clarify. It's a joke, sorry. Lie when I get all like. All right, so clearly this would have been earlier. Once again, probably within 20 to 30 years after before the events, at least. One last passage, just to change things up a little bit. I'm going to quote from the book of Hebrews, at the very beginning of the book of Hebrews. "Long ago, at many times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world." Very profound statement here by the author of Hebrews, who I don't take to be Paul. Once again, I think there's pretty close to being a consensus here that this was likely written before the 70s, because the major topic of the book of Hebrews is the temple. And of course we know that the temple was destroyed in 70 AD or Common Era. Now, what do these passages tell us? And we could add a lot more, but I wanted just to kind of bring in some that I think that are widely discussed. Let me suggest 6 points that these passages tell us. First, note that the passages presume that Jesus was a real historical person, meaning that he was a physical human who lived, suffered, and died prior to his ascension to heaven. Secondly, the theological concept of Son of God is grounded in Jewish beliefs and expectations involving promises in the Hebrew Scriptures to King David that would involve one of his descendants reigning over Israel. Third, Jesus' physical death does not preclude his being the fulfillment of those expectations, but instead is seen as central to Jesus' redemptive mission, despite his disciples' initial misconceptions and misunderstandings. Fourth, such descriptions affirming Jesus as fully human are not exclusive of Jesus' prior existence and continued existence as God. 5. Jesus' resurrection not only confirms his identity as the Son of God, but also anticipates his exaltation and return. 6. None of these inferred suppositions require a pagan influence. Moreover, like its roots in Judaism, early Christians viewed pagan gods, including the mystery religions, as idolatrous and false. In fact, New Testament scholar Larry Hurtado just came out with a book called Destroyer of the Gods, Early Christian Distinctives in the Roman World. And he summarized it this way. He says, in short, early Christianity was the only new religious movement of the Roman era that demanded this exclusive loyalty to one deity, thereby defining all other cults of the time as rivals. End of quote. Now, of course, this all raises the question, why trust the New Testament affirmations? I'm not going to try to argue for the divine inspiration of Scripture. That goes far beyond what we can try to do. What I'm going to argue is that the New Testament is sufficiently historically reliable, I should say, to give adequate testimony to early Christian beliefs and their origins. And I think most scholars today, I think there's obviously a rough consensus of most New Testament scholars date the majority of the New Testament within the first century. Over the years, it was often claimed it was in the second century. We're seeing it get pushed back closer and closer, although some are still under dispute. Also, it's interesting to note that the New Testament, several New Testament writers, Luke being a key example here, appeal to eyewitness testimony. They appeal to eyewitness testimony. Now, even if one wants to dispute the historicity of Luke's account, at the very least what this tells us is that Luke and others are very aware and would make a distinction between things that actually happened and myths. I think there's clear evidence of this in the New Testament writings. I'm not going to go into, but there's some external corroboration of some of the details of the New Testament. We can talk more about that later. I think that people can overstate the evidence here, but I'm not surprised that we don't have a lot, given the fact this is an oral culture, and really this is happening in Palestine, which is not considered a very, it's an important trade route, but it's not necessarily a key place in the Roman Empire. So, what I'm going to suggest is, given this, what is the strongest evidence for affirming the traditional Orthodox hypothesis? And I would argue it is the historicity of the bodily resurrection of Jesus. If we can have good historical grounds to say that Jesus rose from the dead, this would, I think, provide strong confirmation, validating what they believed about Jesus. Now, like I said, this is not technically a debate over the historicity of the resurrection, but I'm just going to highlight 4 points. I think, and we may want to talk about some of this later. I think one important argument is the historicity of the empty tomb. And just to give several points to this effect, we have, for example, the mention of Joseph of Arimathea as the owner of the tomb, and the fact that he was a member of the Sanhedrin. Such historical details suggest historicity. You don't make up, especially if these things if this was written within 30, 40 years, people would have known this. Such a prominent person. Secondly, the fact that in the New Testament writings, especially the Gospels, oftentimes it's talked about the third day, which is, of course, when they discovered the empty tomb. But probably most compelling is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 3, where Paul talks about what I received, I pass on to you as of first importance. That is typical of oral tradition. Most scholars affirm this as evidence that this is an oral tradition that was passed on, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried. So clearly we have an affirmation. And well, like I said, most scholars date this within 10 years of the events themselves. So I think this is a strong argument. Paul goes on and makes reference to post-resurrection appearances. And the fact is that he gives numerous appearances of different times and different people, which suggests that these are hard to explain as merely hallucinations. I know we'll probably talk more about that given my opponent's book and his arguments there. Thirdly, where did the idea of the resurrection come from? The origin of the resurrection belief. Once again, the Jewish belief, although there was some diversity, but most Jews who believed in the resurrection believed that the resurrection would happen at the end of time. It would be a general resurrection. And I think, once again, this is consistent with what we see when Jesus mentions to his disciples about his death and his resurrection. They're perplexed by this. This is not what they expect. We know that this is an early belief of the church because baptism, almost all scholars agree that baptism, Christian baptism was an early practice, and likewise the Lord's Supper, both of which symbolize the resurrection. But I think what's more impressive to me is the fact that here are these men who believe this, and if they didn't, why were they willing to die for something they knew that was a lie? It's one thing to die for something that's a lie, but you believe it's true. But why would these men be willing to die for something they knew was a lie? Also, I think the conversion of Paul speaks strongly to this. What would convert Paul? And I think, once again, it's the post-resurrection. I'm not going to have time, but I can talk. We'll probably get into a discussion about the implausibility of the naturalistic alternatives. I'm just not convinced that any of them measure up in terms of explanatory scope and explanatory power. So let me conclude. If there is a God, then the Son of God is historically possible and philosophically plausible. I'm not an ancient historian. I'm not a New Testament scholar. I'm a philosopher, theologian. I study philosophy, the relationship between philosophy and theology. And it seems to me that philosophical assumption, a presupposition here, is really critical. If there is a God, then the Son of God, the idea of the Son of God is historically possible and philosophically plausible. If there is no God, or no divine action, that is, one presumes atheism or theistic naturalism, then at best, the Son of God is a myth, and at worst, a deceptive delusion. In my view, the existence of God cannot be conclusively determined by historical grounds, but requires prior philosophical considerations and arguments. Since the existence of God is a necessary presupposition to the historical existence of a real and historical Son of God, then one cannot determine the origin and plausibility of the Son of God on historical grounds alone. And I think this would be a point that Richard and I will probably disagree on. I'm not convinced that you can make a historical argument that's sufficient to demonstrate one way or the other without considering naturalism or theism. So I look forward to Richard's arguments, and I think we'll have a substantive exchange. Thank you.
Of course, I need to drop the mic.
Yeah. We'll give you a moment, Richard. I'd like to introduce you. I'd like folks to know who you are. Our second speaker is Dr. Richard Carrier. I had a wonderful conversation with him over from the airport. He's very sharp. Looking forward to what he has to say. He is professor of ancient history with a PhD from Columbia, and he writes on early science. You can see many of his books right here. And he's going to be lecturing around the country. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Carrier.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Is this place well? Okay, good. Hello, it's great to be here. This is very interesting. All right, I'm just going to get right to it, and I'll ask about time at some point later on. So I actually kind of agree with that last point more than I guess you expected. This is really a question about the nature of the universe and not just a particular historical event. So we do have to go both directions on that. And the evidence required and the evidence pertaining, therefore, differs on both of those parts of the proposition. Now we have to begin with the logic of evidence. How can we justify the conclusion from the evidence available? Now, this is always a question of probability. What is the most probable conclusion? Because no statements of fact can be known for certainty. And a conclusion is only rendered probable in two ways. First, it can be probable because it happens a lot. It's demonstrably frequent. People actually being the sons of gods is not frequent, so we can't get there that way. Second, it can be probable because the available evidence is unlikely unless it's true. In other words, the evidence is not expected if the claim is false. Now, I'm going to argue that there is no such evidence for Jesus being the Son of God. That's one point this debate will turn on, so I'll get back to that. But on the other hand of things, the conclusion can also be rendered improbable in two ways. First, it can require assumptions that we don't have any evidence for. Such assumptions, therefore, have a high probability of already being false, and I would argue that Jesus being the Son of a God requires too many assumptions like that. And that's another point I'll expand on later. Second, it can be improbable because the available evidence is unlikely if it's true. The flip side of that other point. And accordingly, I will be arguing that the evidence is not what we would expect if Jesus really were the Son of a God, and that will be another point that I will address as we continue with this debate. So those are the central issues of this, and that's what we're going to be arguing around. Now, first, we have the problem that for Jesus to be the Son of a God, there must be gods. Not just gods, but gods who intervene miraculously in human history. But we have not observed any reliable evidence that any such gods exist. Always, when evidence is presented, it either very conveniently can't be fact-checked, or when it is fact-checked, it turns out to be false or not evidence of gods after all. And maybe we'll get to some examples of that in the course of the debate. So far, no actual evidence has been presented for the existence of gods. The existence of gods is therefore, on present information, improbable. This means Jesus being the Son of God requires adopting an improbable assumption. And that means Jesus being the Son of God is improbable because it commutes. The probability of the premise commutes to the probability of the conclusion. Second, a real God would not produce stories that look just like they were made up and then present no adequate evidence for them being true. Humans making stories up, however, will often produce stories that look a lot like other made-up stories at the same time and place. They'll be creative, they'll have their own differences, every story will be different in every religion, but there will be commonalities that make them look very similar as mythology. Now, the ancient world was full of claims of men being the sons of gods. In Greece and Rome, this was extremely common. And they had biographies written about them with stories no one today believes are true. And the stories of Jesus look a lot like those stories in all the relevant respects. We should therefore expect his stories to be as made up as theirs are, because that's what routinely happened back then. As we have so many other examples, that's exactly what happened. The claim that Jesus is the sole exception among all of them, that unlike other sons of gods of the same time, his stories of godhood are true, that makes that an extraordinary claim, because it's an exceptional claim, which simply means it's an inherently improbable claim. So we need extraordinary evidence to believe it. We need to really show that he is the exception to the case. And I will argue, of course, that we have none, so we shouldn't believe it. Now, just like with those other sons of gods, we have no eyewitness reports of any divine attributes for Jesus, or divine endorsements for that matter. When we look at the eyewitness information that we have from eyewitnesses, we have only reports of dreams and visions confirming Jesus as divine. Stories about his life that did that arose a whole lifetime later. Back then, an average lifespan was about 48 years. The Gospels arise just after the average person would be dead. And these stories arise from unknown writers. We don't really know who they are. We can't really verify who they are, using unknown sources. None of them name where they get any of their information. No reasonable historians trust stories like that. These are the kinds of stories that we definitely doubt. It's not good evidence, certainly not extraordinary evidence. If Jesus is not really the Son of God, however, just like all those other sons of gods weren't, we should expect to observe exactly what we already do. We would expect only dreams and visions of him being divine or endorsed by gods, and that they would only occur to die-hard believers, only for a very brief time and only in one single culture and geographic location, and only exceedingly rarely to anyone else. And even they will be closely connected with those other believers and inspired by their interaction with those believers. Because that's the typical pattern for visions and dreams in all other religions. It's how we see other religions start, other religions change, and so on. And we would have no other evidence. And lo and behold, We don't. That's all we have. So what we observe is exactly what we'd expect to observe if the claim is false. By contrast, if Jesus really was the Son of God, unlike those other sons of gods, we should expect to observe something else. Jesus would appear not only to die-hard believers and a rare few others connected to them, but to a great many outsiders all over the world in every culture and generation. It is improbable that a real Son of God would act exactly like all the false sons of gods and not do anything distinctive of a true Son of God. That Jesus is a real one is therefore improbable, just like it is for all those other sons of gods. For example, if a real Son of a God were really appearing to people and really was on a compassionate mission to reform and save the world, then there is no credible reason he would appear to only one persecutor, Paul, rather than to all of them. But if Paul's experience was entirely natural, a chance quirk of events in a man already prone to visions, and not at all a divine event, then we should expect such an event to be rare, possibly even unique. And lo and behold, that appears to be the case. Paul's conversion's uniqueness actually supports the conclusion that Christianity originated from natural phenomena of human psychology and human sociology, and not from any encounter with a real God. It's what we expect from a non-God, whereas a real God would not limit his appearance to a one-off chance quirk fellow. A real God, whom the Gospels even depict as able to fly and teleport, could have visited Pilate, Herod, the Sanhedrin, the masses of Jerusalem, the Roman legions, even the Emperor and Senate of Rome. He could even have flown to America, as the Mormons actually believe he did, and even to China, preaching in all the temples and courts of Asia. In fact, being a God, he could have appeared to everyone on earth. He could visit me right now, or you. He could settle this debate right here, right now. The fact that we have to debate it through words, and we don't have actually the evidence of the Son of God here, I think is a strong point that we're talking about a false Son of God, just like all the others. They can't appear here either. And yet instead, in those days, besides his already fanatical followers and his family and heirs, just one odd fellow ever saw him. If Jesus was a God and really wanted to save the world, he would have appeared and delivered his gospel personally to the whole world. He would not appear only to one small group of believers and one lone outsider in one tiny place just one time 2,000 years ago and then give up. But if Christianity originated naturally by dreams and visions, like countless other false religions have, then we would expect it to arise in only one small group in one small place and time, and especially where, as in antiquity, regular dreamers or hallucinators were often respected as holy, and their dreams or hallucinations believed to be divine communications. And that's exactly where and when Christianity began. It began in exactly that culture where those kinds of things were believed widely, and other religions were begun in the same way. The ordinary explanation thus predicts everything we see, whereas the extraordinary explanation predicts things we don't see. We should also expect that a compassionate God who wanted us to know his message of salvation would not allow any errors or alterations to be made to the book containing that message. We would be supernaturally incapable of making such changes, and thus all Bibles ever made from antiquity to the present would be miraculously identical, proving their authority and reliability, yet they are not. Thousands of errors and alterations exist in the manuscripts. No two manuscripts are identical, and none match what any expert believes the original text said. If they were unalterable and continually consistent, that would verify that the message they contain was a true message, whereas otherwise they look just like any other human-made document. The message in these books looks exactly like just one more human-made message purporting to be from the gods, such as every other religion produces. It looks just like every other man-made religious text. Christians are also granted no gifts or abilities that aren't just as often found in many false religions too, so there's no evidence their gods are any more real than anyone else's gods. We can extend this observation all the way back in human time. Given its importance and supposed fitness and elegance, the gospel should have been revealed, preached, and known to every shaman and every tribe of the human race from the dawn of history until now, rather than never heard of by anyone, anywhere, ever before, until 10,000 years of civilization had gone by. 10,000 years is a really long time. And then heard of in only one place and time, and thereafter spread merely by humans, not by gods, and solely by word of mouth. That Jesus revealed the true gospel only once, and only to some Palestinians, and only after thousands of years of other religions prevailing, even in Palestine, is exactly what we expect if this was just a human-made religion. The odds of all this being the case are pretty much 100%, very nearly. Fully expected. But the odds of all this being the case if Jesus really was God's son and really did care about all humankind, it's surely not 100%, as if we could predict with absolute certainty from the premise that, quote, Jesus is the Son of God and cares about all humankind, end quote, that we could predict from that premise that Jesus would never reveal himself at the same time to Asians and Indians and Celts and Australians and Persians and Native Americans and all other peoples occupying the globe back then and now. In other words, appear to all humankind whom he supposedly has a message for. No, the odds of none of the latter happening cannot possibly be 100% expected. It must be something less than that, which means the evidence supports Jesus not being the Son of God, because all the evidence is more likely if he wasn't. Finally, we have all the bizarre facts of Christianity, which make little sense if it's true, but perfect sense if it was just a natural product of its time and place, like every other religion. For example, why does God even bother bearing a son? He could send an angel, the Holy Spirit, or reveal himself directly or through any other means. Why does he need to actually impregnate a woman and wait decades while the resulting child grows up and then wanders around preaching with all the illogical limitations of a mere mortal in one tiny place? We can explain this culturally, because that was then the fashionable thing. Gods were routinely believed to impregnate women and their sons to walk the earth telling tales and founding kingdoms and suffering troubles and torments until ascending to their celestial glory. That's a weird thing to believe now, if you think about it. It's no longer a peculiarity of our culture. It's something that we believe in commonly. But back then, it was a peculiarity of the culture. This was a fashionable thing to believe. There were lots of gods like this. That Christianity would begin with such an idea is exactly the sort of thing we expect if it's merely a product of its time and culture, because it grows up looking a lot like these ideas back then. But as an idea of a universal God who is not bound by any fleeting fashions and peculiar cultural expectations like that, a God to whom such ideas should surely seem as quaintly silly as they now would to us if people were to start walking around claiming they were gods. It's certainly not 100% exactly what we expect. So again, the very idea of Jesus being a son of a God is unlikely. The evidence is rather exactly what we expect if he was just another false son of God like all the others. He looks just like the cultural fashions of the time, which make no sense outside of those cultures. Likewise, a son of a God who has to be killed, then rise from the dead and ascend to heaven, that was also a fashionable idea in that culture at that time. The goddess Inanna, the god Romulus, the god Osiris, the god Zalmoxis, all had stories just like that. Killed, risen from the dead, and ascended to heaven. Yet no other culture did it. The ancient Chinese didn't have these dying and rising gods, nor has that really culture had a fashion for them ever since. It was only fashionable at this particular time and place. So it's not a coincidence that this is when a Jewish sect borrows the idea and invents their own Jewish version of it. It looks just like it came from the culture of the time. Even the idea of bestowing liberty from sins by a spiritual death and rebirth through a ritual baptism predates Christianity, comes from pagan ideas. And securing through thereby eternal life in paradise, even that was a common fact before Christians borrowed the idea and attached it to Jesus. Those ideas were fundamental to the cults of Osiris and Dionysus even before Christianity arose. There were lots of gods like these. Then it seemed natural. Now, let's be honest, it seems a little silly. I mean, as Captain Kirk said in Star Trek V, what need does God have of a starship? Well, just like him, we too should ask, what need does God have of a dying and rising demigod? It's not as if this is in any way what we would expect a universal God needs to forgive sins. Quite the contrary, except for that bizarrely peculiar and entirely parochial cultural fad for dying and rising divine sons who forgive sins, a fad all the rage back then, it's not even remotely what we would normally expect. A real God could just forgive sins. Creating a baby, killing it, restoring it to life serves no needed function for an omnipotent being who doesn't need to engage in those kinds of things. Indeed, the whole notion of blood sacrifice, of vicarious atonement, those were commonplace then, and very much in the mindset of the time, but are now seen for what they are, just a magical primitive superstition. That someone can accept the punishment for someone else, even in general, is hardly believed to be just or appropriate anymore. If it were, we'd allow criminals to walk free if they could find anyone to volunteer to do their time for them. And that God, quote-unquote, likes the smell of burning flesh, as it claimed in Ephesians 5, or, quote-unquote, needs blood to effect atonement, or that the blood of a God's Son is more magical power than animal blood, as Paul claimed in Hebrews 9, all of that is a primitive superstition that no one would take seriously anymore if it came from any other religion. back then it was taken very seriously indeed. But God is not a primitive slave to an ancient culture or to superstitious magical thinking. Only men were. Thus, that Christianity would be founded on a primitive superstition of blood atonement magic is 100% exactly the sort of thing we should expect if Christianity is false, if it's just a product of its culture and its time. Because then it will have as its core ideas just what was culturally assumed it should then have. But that is certainly not at all what we'd expect if God is real, as if a cosmic God who made the universe 14 billion years ago is still hung up on blood magic. So we have to accept that the very idea of Jesus being the Son of a God is improbable. The evidence we have is also improbable if he was a real Son of a God, but it's exactly what we'd expect to find if he was another false Son of a God like all the others were. And this notion also requires assuming there are actually gods in the first place, which is also an improbable assumption. So that then entails that any conclusion that requires that assumption is also improbable. Consequently, if we are to adhere to the sound logic of evidence, we have to honestly conclude it is very improbable that Jesus was actually the Son of a God. Those are the main points I want to make, and I'm going to ask how much time I have left. Where are we?
About 3 minutes.
3 minutes. All right, I'm going to close with one other point. Mark 7. There's a passage in Mark 7 where the Pharisees are portrayed as coming to him and saying that his disciples are not following the commandments or the rules of washing their hands before handling their dinner commitments, before eating dinner. There were these human rules, these Jewish rules about washing your dishes, washing your hands and stuff before you eat. And they're asking, why doesn't he instruct his disciples to do this? And Jesus goes on, well, those are human-made commands, they're not God's commands. Nothing bad's going to come into you from your hands. It only comes out of you from speech and things like that. Now, this is interesting. It has an interesting moral context in terms of sectarian disputes among the Jews, but there's a telltale feature of this story that we should note, which is that the person who wrote this story clearly didn't know about germs. So here's a moment where if you were a god, if you had the mind of a god, you know about germs. You know 50% of all children back then died from diseases, did not survive to adulthood, 50%. You know this. Don't you think this is the one opportunity in the world, if you were the Son of God, to explain germ theory? To tell people, actually, you know what? Your human rules, washing your hands before you eat, that's a really good idea. In fact, you should wash your hands and wash other things a lot more. Let me give you some explanation about this idea that how you can avoid some diseases that are killing all your kids. Now, the reason Jesus in this story doesn't tell that, where Jesus doesn't seem to know that washing your hands is actually a good idea, he doesn't know about germ theory of disease, is because the people who wrote this story were as ignorant then as everyone else at the time. No one back then knew the germ theory of disease. But this shows that the book was written, the story was written by people who did not have a channel to God. They only had the same ignorant knowledge of all humans of their time. It was a human document written by ignorant men. A God would not have produced that story. Thank you.
All right, we will now have 10 minutes for rebuttal by Dr. Gurney. Whenever you're ready.
Richard made a lot of points, and you guys hear it okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me summarize what I think his 3 main points here and objections. First, he presupposes that the Gospels are totally unreliable. Notice he talks about the life of Jesus, and of course, I didn't hear him say this, but I take it that he just believes that the Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have no historical credibility. I think that's a pretty radical position. Certainly you can find New Testament scholars who affirm that, but they're by far the minority. I mean, even members of the Jesus Seminar, who are pretty on the more extreme side of New Testament scholarship, would affirm certain things to be historically reliable. So I think that that's a highly dubious premise, at least to make your case. Secondly, it seems to me that he wants to give as his explanation these pagan religions. And it was interesting in reading his book, The Historicity of Jesus, several of his sources. And let me, one of the sources he quotes by Mettinger called The Riddle of the Resurrection. And I'm going to quote this at length because I think it's important not just to cite a source, but to give their reasons. He appeals to Mettinger on the grounds that of this pre-New Testament resurrection stories. But let me quote at length in Mettinger's epilogue. He says, "The question that thus presents itself is what ultimate results would be of a study of the New Testament material on the resurrection of Jesus in the light of our investigation of the dying and rising deities of the ancient Near Eastern world. Such deities were obviously known in Palestine in New Testament times. That study cannot be undertaken here, but I would like to call attention to the following points. 1. The figures we have studied are deities. In the case of Jesus, we are confronted with a human, for whom divinity was claimed by himself and by his followers. For the disciples, and for Paul, the resurrection of Jesus was a one-time historical event that took place at one specific point in the earth's topography. The empty tomb was seen as a historical datum. 2. The dying and rising gods were closely related to the seasonal cycle. Their death and return were seen as reflected in the changes of plant life. The death and resurrection of Jesus is a one-time event, not repeated and unrelated to seasonal changes. 3. The death of Jesus is presented in the sources as vicarious suffering as an act of atonement for sins. The myth of Damizi had an arrangement with bilocation and substitution, but there is no evidence for the death and dying and rising gods as vicarious suffering for sins. There is, as far as I am aware, no prima facie evidence that the death and resurrection of Jesus is a mythological construct, drawing on the myths and rites of the dying and rising gods of the surrounding world. While studied with profit against the background of the Jewish resurrection belief, the faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus retains its unique character in the history of religions. The riddle remains. Other examples could be multiplied from Mettinger. This idea of the dying gods as being mythology has been borrowed by the early Christians. While it was very popular 50 years ago, there are very few defenders today among New Testament scholars. Give another example. Martin Hengel, a well-known New Testament scholar, on his book on crucifixion. He says all of this evidence, this is from his book Crucifixion, he says all this evidence shows us the constantly varying forms of abhorrence at the new religious teaching. In comparison with the religious ideals of the ancient world, the Christian message had inevitably to be described, in Suetonius' words, has a new and pernicious superstition. These accounts, with their marked contemptuous characterizations, are no coincidence. The heart of the Christian message, which Paul described as the word of the cross, ran counter not only to Roman political thinking, but to the whole ethos of religion in ancient times, and in particular to the ideas of God held by educated people. True, the Hellenistic world was familiar with the death and apophisias of some predominantly barbarian demigods and heroes of primeval times. Attis and Adonis were killed by a wild boar. Osiris was torn to pieces by Typhon Seth, and Dionysius Tigris by the Titans. Heracles alone of the Greeks volunteered immolation himself on Mount Oeda. However, not only did this take place in the darkest and most distant past, but it was narrated in questionable myths which had to be interpreted either humoristically or at least allegorically. By contrast, to believe that the one pre-existent Son of the one true God, the mediator of creation and the Redeemer of the world, had appeared in very recent times in out-of-the-way Galilee as a member of the obscure people of the Jews, and even worse, had died the death of a common criminal on the cross, could only be regarded as a sign of madness. The real gods of Greece and Rome could be distinguished from mortal men by the very fact that they were immortal. They had absolutely nothing in common with the cross as a sign of shame. And he goes on. I think that the arguments, in fact, I've been looking at, trying to find reviews on Richard's books. I just found no New Testament scholars I could find coming out endorsing it. In fact, I read several New Testament scholars who were very critical of, they felt like he didn't really engage in New Testament scholarship. Now, in reading his book, I know that he is very critical of these scholars, which is interesting. On the one hand, he'll quote them when he agrees with them. When he disagrees with them, he tends to dismiss them rather than refute their arguments. Third, the final, and this seems to be probably the most, in his opening argument as well as in his book, he seems to have this supposition, and probably the best way to describe it is this. If God is really real, then God should do X. God should do X, fill in the blank. And there's a lot of his arguments are based upon what he expects should happen. And this is the problem, I think, and we haven't talked about Bayes' theorem, but when I read his book on proving history, I thought it was very interesting. Trying to use Bayes' theorem to make a historical argument. Once again, I scoured the academic databases. I couldn't find anybody who came out, any historians. I actually talked to a couple of professional historians, and asked them, I said, have you ever heard anybody try to use Bayes' theorem to argue for a historical conclusion? And they're like, no. They were rather perplexed by that idea. What's interesting, though, in terms of Bayes' theorem, is there is a philosopher who has used Bayes' theorem. His name is Richard Swinburne. He's a well-known philosopher for religion. In fact, he doesn't try to make a historical argument, but he does appeal to historical considerations. But interestingly enough, in his book, The Resurrection of God Incarnate, he uses Bayes' theorem to prove exactly the opposite point that Richard does, which I think suggests a very important point. That in making probability calculations, there is a subjective element here. And once again, what I would submit to you is if you grant the truth of naturalism, then yeah, clearly the idea of God, and especially the idea of the Son of God, and the idea of the vicarious atonement, all of those things seem implausible, improbable. But once again, the question remains, is there good reasons to believe that God exists? I would say that there is. And until one can prove otherwise, then you can't just assume, you just can't assume that naturalism is the default position. And I think Richard does that. How am I doing on time?
Still have another minute.
Well, I'll stop there.
All right, we'll now have 10 minutes of rebuttal from Dr. Carrier.
Okay. So I'll start off by pointing out that I do not assume naturalism. Not even in general. I actually have a whole book, about 400 pages, defending naturalism as to why I believe it's true. Sense and Goodness Without God, a defense of metaphysical naturalism. Any of you are free to look at these books, by the way. I'll be happy to sell or sign any of them if you're interested. But the point being, that book extensively argues for it. However, in this debate, I'm not even relying on naturalism. I haven't mentioned it, really. I don't know if there's, I don't think we need to settle the question of whether there's supernatural things. What needs to be done, however, is we need evidence presented that gods exist and intervene in the world. And so far, in the technical terms of debate, no evidence has been presented at the podium that gods exist and intervene in the world. So that premise has not been established. And also, no evidence has been established that any divine attributes of Jesus are attested by any eyewitnesses. We haven't even gotten that far yet. I mean, eyewitnesses aren't necessarily going to be reliable, but we haven't even gotten eyewitness testimony yet of anything that establishes Jesus as divine. I am not, in this debate, challenging the historicity of Jesus. I could challenge that in another debate, but here I'll completely grant that there is not only that Jesus existed, but there could even be historically true pieces of information about him in the Gospels. What we don't have, however, is any evidence that Jesus was endorsed by God or actually was a God or the Son of God. Any evidence of that from any reliable source. We do not know what the source is. We do not know who wrote it, when they wrote it, why they wrote it that way. It was written, if at all, a lifetime later. The stories. Human lifetime. It's a long time. But when we look at Paul, we finally have an eyewitness. All Paul ever refers to are dreams and visions. that we know there are the exact kind of experiences being held by other Jews, by other pagans of the time, by people in world religions all over the place. So merely saying that you saw a vision in which Jesus said he was the Son of God does not establish that that is actually true, any more than it establishes for the Caudai cult who believe that Victor Hugo is a god. They also have visions of Victor Hugo confirming he's a god. That does not establish that Victor Hugo is a god. So we can't use that information, and that's why the Gospels aren't usable here. It's not that they're completely false. Whether they are or not is a whole separate debate. They could have true information in them, but we do not have any established evidence that anything in them that relates to the divinity of Jesus is actually true, and can even go back to an eyewitness source. Most of what the rebuttal given to you was about is talking about what people believed with regard to the ancient gods, with regard to the pagan gods, with regard to the Jews, and so on. But talking about what people believed is not evidence that what they believed is true. And this is supposed to be a debate about whether certain things people believed are actually true. So most of that stuff is not relevant to what I'm talking about, even though I could go into a whole debate arguing against a lot of what we said, since a lot of it I think is false. It actually isn't relevant to the debate, so I can set most of it aside. To give you an example, though, with regard to Bayes' theorem, I don't even have to actually use Bayes' theorem in this thing. I haven't done the equation, I haven't done any math for you. But this idea that the hypothesis entails that God should do certain things, if the hypothesis is true. This is basic evidential reasoning. How do you test a theory? How do you even know it's true if it makes no predictions that are unlikely to happen if it's false? It's not possible to prove a proposition if it makes no predictions that are unexpected if it's false. If those predictions are fully expected if it is false, then you don't have evidence for your proposition. And that's just what we're talking about here. And when we get to, like, for example, Swinburne, we could talk about the exact argument there, but it's just like logic. You can get completely different conclusions with logic if you start with different premises. And that's exactly what Swinburne is doing. Have we presented the premises of Swinburne? Have we established that they're valid? No. If we can't defend the premises of Swinburne, then we can't defend his conclusions either. So that's the basic rebuttal. I do not presuppose the unreliability of the gospel. I don't say they have no historical credibility here in this debate. I'm talking about what can we prove from them is actually true. Very little. Instead, as I noted, they actually seem to be written by humans that don't even know things like germ theory in their portrayal of Jesus. They don't portray Jesus as someone who actually has divine knowledge. They portray Jesus as just one of them who has the same ignorance that they do. And that's not what we expect from a son of a god, an actual son of a god, certainly. And in regard to that, messenger and so on, we can talk about the differences between the different cults. All of the Red, Dying, and Rising gods had differences. They were all unique. All their religions were unique. So saying that Christianity was unique does not support the divinity of Jesus any more than it supports the divinity of Osiris or Zalmoxis or any of the others. How their particular doctrines differed, they all differed. But what they did all have in common is they have gods that became incarnate, died, and then were resurrected, and then give salvation to their followers through the cleansing of sins, through a ritual baptism that is a ritual death and rebirth. We have this from an eyewitness account, in fact. Apuleius writes about his going through the baptism of Osiris, and he describes it as a ritual death and rebirth through which he gains eternal life in paradise. And in the Egyptian system, the story was that your soul, when you died, would be weighed on a scale against a feather, and if your sins were too heavy, you would fall. The feather would not protect you. And if you fell on your scales, your sins were too heavy, you would get devoured by a monster, you would go to hell. But if the feather in you balanced, your sins were light, you would get passage to paradise. Therefore, what Osiris' death and resurrection accomplishes, or at least what he bestows to his followers through the ritual baptism, is this ability to pass this sins test. He's wiping their sins clean so they can balance themselves against a feather in the afterlife. Now, this is a totally different system, but there are commonalities, and it's the commonalities that are peculiar. These are a lot of weird things, and it only exists in this culture that we see this passion for these ideas going on. Okay, so well, that's one aspect of it. Nothing else really relates to Jesus being the Son of God, as opposed to Christianity being a unique and different religion than all the others, but all the religions were unique and different from the others. And there isn't anything that has to do with Jesus actually being the Son of a God that's left to rebut. How much time do I have?
About a little over 3 minutes.
Okay, good to know. I'll give you an example of what I mean. This claim that the witnesses were willing to die. Now we could challenge some aspects of that in terms of who we're even talking about, what evidence we have regarding what they died for, if they died at all. But let's even assume that they did. Paul tells us what he would have died for, why he believed. He had a revelation. He says, I did not learn it from flesh and blood. I received it in a revelation of God, revealed Jesus in me. He's talking about a vision. That's what convinced him that all this was true. And if he believed it, as many in other religions do believe these communications from the gods like this, we see this in all other religions. Of course he'd be willing to die for that. He would believe that that was really a communication from God. Now we in hindsight looking out and seeing that, well, actually there's all these other religions that are also having visions of gods and therefore being completely convinced that their gods exist. They can't all be true. So this is clearly a phenomenon that happens naturally. It is not therefore evidence of the existence of actual sons of God. It's no more proof that Jesus is really the Son of God than it's proof that Victor Hugo is, and when members of the Cow Die cult have spirit communications from Victor Hugo. So that's the problem with the evidence. We haven't gotten past that. There hasn't been any point in this debate where we've been given evidence that gets us one step beyond what someone believed to whether what they believed was true. And that's what we really need to get at. And we don't really have anything here to work with, and that ties us back into all of the things I pointed out in my opening statement. Let's see if there's anything else to bring up. Those things aren't really necessary. Okay, one point. Luke 1. Luke does not say he got his information from eyewitnesses there. He says he got his information from some sort of written documents, other previous Gospels he said that were written down. He doesn't name them. We actually happen to know who they were, Matthew and Mark, or Q and Mark, depending on which theory you adopt, because he copies them verbatim in Greek. But he says that what they contained, he believed, was passed on by eyewitnesses. He never establishes that it actually did come from eyewitness testimony. And he never cites any eyewitnesses. He does not appear to know any eyewitnesses. He never mentions having his information from any eyewitnesses. And that's the closest we get. We have similar, you can look at some of the statements in John and things like that, but Mark and Matthew don't even mention sources at all. So this is the problem that we have with these documents. Written by unknown persons a lifetime later with unstated sources, we just can't establish amazing claims in them. It's really, really hard to establish any claims from them. But none of those claims, even in mainstream Jesus studies, none of those claims that mainstream historians claim that they can extract from the Gospels are things that confirm that Jesus was really a Son of God, as opposed to someone who might have believed that, or that someone who acted in such a way that people came to believe that of him. And then we have the resurrection. Frankly, there are lots of reasons tombs can end up empty. We know typically the reasons tombs end up empty is not that rose from the dead. There are other explanations for that. So I'll leave it at that. We can probably get into the resurrection more later.
I can have my speakers up here in front. We're going to use these two chairs here. We're going to enter the dialogue portion of our debate, and this is where the speakers will have a chance to query one another. They will ask and respond, and we'll go ahead and keep this as open as we can so the speakers can have the opportunity to challenge each other, to push for weaknesses, and also to demonstrate strengths. So this will be a great chance for us to be able to see how they can kind of go back and forth one-on-one. We'll give the speakers just a moment to collect themselves.
Have some technical issues.
We're doing the dialogue, right? Yes, dialogue. Yes, on the first question. See if I can get to the heart of this. So what I'm looking for, have a debate about this, if this was any other subject that we're talking about trying to prove as a scientific debate or anything like that. So what I need is, what's a statement that we have from an eyewitness that doesn't merely testify to what they believed, because people can believe things for all sorts of reasons, but that is actual itself evidence that we can confirm that what they believed is true, and that establishes Jesus as the Son of God.
So I'm not sure if I understand your question, because...
Yeah, I can restate that.
Well, I'm wondering from an epistemological perspective, because it seems like what you want to do is you want to say, in order for it to qualify as historical evidence, it must be predictive. But that doesn't seem to me to apply to a lot of historical evidence.
Oh, all claims about history make predictions about what evidence exists, and all established conclusions in history rely on that evidence being unlikely unless the conclusion is true. And this is true for all history in peer-reviewed history today. Whether the historians are aware of the probability logic of what they're doing, it is exactly what they're doing. We're always looking for evidence that is unlikely on every other possibility except the one that we're defending.
Yeah, but it seems to me that given the fact that history tends to be unique, there tends to be unique events that happen, I mean, it just seems to me that I'm curious about what sources you would cite in terms of that premise. I mean, I'm not an expert on historiography, but I've read enough. You know, I haven't heard anybody define it quite that way. So I'm trying to understand your position here. That because once again, if you know,
let's work it backwards then.
Okay.
Let's go to what you think is evidence from an eyewitness. We'll start with that part of it. That Jesus is the Son of God.
Okay. So let's take the empty tomb. Discovering the empty tomb.
We don't have any eyewitness accounts for that.
So you don't. That presumes that the Gospels aren't giving us eyewitness testimony.
We have no evidence that the Gospels are eyewitness testimony. They don't even say that they're eyewitness testimony.
Why do they have to say they're eyewitness testimony in order to count as eyewitness testimony?
For us to know.
I mean, my reading. I mean, I'm not an ancient historian, but I've read enough ancient history. Most people don't cite sources. They just say so and so said this. They don't cite. They don't try to.
Actually, they do often cite sources, and when they don't, we often have the same problem of being skeptical of what their source is.
That is my experience of reading. Like I said, I'm not an ancient historian, but I've read enough. You know, ancient history. They rarely cite. You know, they just. I just don't see that in the literature.
Well, okay, so yeah, I think you're confusing two different things. There's the Gospels claiming to be reporting what eyewitnesses are saying, versus the Gospels being written by eyewitnesses. Now, are you rejecting the latter proposition?
What I'm saying is...
I'm trying to figure out which thing you're trying to argue for.
I'm saying is that, let's take this just to bring clarity here. So when Luke says, Luke chapter 1, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compare a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us.
Mm-hmm.
So
the Christian community. Yeah.
Right, so he's claiming that this, and then he goes on and says, it seemed good to me also, having followed all these things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you most excellent Theophilus.
Where does he say that he's relying on eyewitnesses?
Well, he just says that
he says others have written this down that were passed on by eyewitnesses.
Well, he's appealing to eyewitness. I mean, that's a pretty standard.
He's just stating what he believes. How do you know that belief is true?
No, he's appealing that these stories came from eyewitnesses.
That's not what the grammar says.
No, the grammar does say that.
No, it doesn't say that the people who were writing it down were themselves eyewitnesses. It said they wrote down what was handed out by eyewitnesses.
He got this from eyewitness testimony.
No, he says he's using books written by people.
No, this is an oral culture. I don't know.
I'm trying to explain what Luke is saying.
I'm going to step in for a moment. We need to go a little bit more time for each speaker to develop their thoughts.
I mean, to be honest with you, I think, you know, there's probably at least a dozen commentaries from a broad cross-section of scholarship who would affirm that Luke is using eyewitness testimony. In fact, contrary to what you said, while Luke does use Q, Mark, he does use all other sources as well. That's pretty well established in Luke's
Let's start
scholarship.
there then. Give me an example of something in Luke that establishes Jesus as the Son of God that doesn't come from Mark and doesn't come from Q.
It doesn't come from Mark, off the top of my head. Well, I can't. Off the top of my head, I can't.
That's tough, I know. Yeah.
Right.
But that's the first problem you have to solve.
Well, I mean,
but we know he's not using eyewitnesses if he's using Mark. We know.
Well, the birth narratives
would
be. I would think the birth narratives would be.
The birth narratives you think come from eyewitnesses?
Mary. He would have access to Mary.
Okay, but he doesn't say that. So how would you?
Well, that's my point.
We could say that about any text. We could say that about the American stories of Hercules that someone saw them.
But that's not a standard convention I see in ancient writings.
Yes, it is.
Richard, hold on. Let's give Mike a chance to
Yeah, I'm just not, I mean, I just don't see, when I'm reading ancient literature, both Christians and non-Christians, they often say things, they don't necessarily give the source.
They don't necessarily, but if they don't, then we don't know what their source, they don't know their source is an eyewitness. There's no point in history where historians read a historian and the historian doesn't say their source and that they assume it's an eyewitness. We don't do that.
Well, I'm not assuming, I'm just saying is that they don't always say their sources.
This is the problem. We need an eyewitness source that we can actually...
Why is that a requirement? That's more of a modern convention than an ancient convention.
Yeah, because we have better methods now. We know that anonymous
but we can't hold them guilty.
If we can't even tie it to the source, why believe it? We could do that for every religion. We could do that for Cao Dai, Islam, Buddhism. We have tons of examples of information being conveyed where we don't know what the source is.
But based upon
it doesn't make it true.
But based upon that would then, I think, raise questions about much of what we think we know historically we don't. I mean, that's pretty high standard.
Yes.
But I think, and I would say
that's
that
the standard.
It seems to me that most
if we don't know that the source is an eyewitness source, or we don't know what their source is, then we don't know. We can't say that it is therefore an eyewitness source and therefore true.
Right, but
there's no basis for that.
But there's a distinction here. I think there's a point, we need to make a distinct point. One is the citation of sources. And once again, my contention is that the ancients don't always cite their sources.
That's fine. Let me just grant that. That's not entirely true, but it doesn't matter for this debate. Let's just assume it's been the case that they never cite sources. It still is the case that we don't know they're using an eyewitness source.
Right. They may or may not be.
We don't know the source. We don't even know they're using a source. They might just be making it up.
They could. That's possible.
Yeah, that's my problem. So how do we establish that it's true, not merely something someone...
Right, that's why we try to find other ways to validate whether or not
that gets back to my original question. And so what's an example of something that is not merely evidence of what someone believed, but is evidence that what they believed is true, that establishes Jesus as the Son of God?
But I take it that they believed it because they thought it was true. Right?
But they could have believed it for other reasons. So we need evidence that they're believing.
Why would they believe something if they knew it was a lie?
Gentlemen, I'm going to step in for a moment. I think the question's already been answered. It's just being restated now. I'm feeling like this is
actually it hasn't been. We're trying to. But what we're doing is we're reciprocally we're narrowing in on it. Right? So
you may be narrowing, but my concern is that we don't want to narrow so much that the audience loses interest here. I think it's important.
But his last comment, I think, really gets us closer.
Well, we can try. If we can try and ask the question in a different way, that'd be fine. But I think it's important not to rehash previously established things.
Can you remind me of the last statement? Because you were really onto something there, and now I've lost track of the interruption. Sorry.
That's right. So in other words, if I take it, typically people, ancients and moderns, if they believe something, they believe it because they believe it's true.
Yeah, but there's, for example, the Cao Dai worshippers believe Victor Hugo is God. That doesn't make it true.
Oh, I agree.
And it's not a lie. They genuinely believe it.
Right, but
this is what I'm getting. Yeah. But since that's possible, if we were debating Cao Dai right now, and I was a Cao Dai proponent, you would be asking me exactly what I'm asking you right now.
Right, I'm asking what grounds you believe that is true.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's what I'm asking you.
Right. And what I'm saying is they experienced in history, they had experiences with Jesus. He performed miracles, exorcisms, and of course, as I said, the resurrection, which I think to be the confirmation of his message.
Well, okay, so the confirmation of his message,
right. If you claim, if they hear him teaching that he is the Messiah, and they understand it based upon their based upon the Jewish roots, that the idea that some guys associated with Messiah, and he explains that to them, and he teaches them that.
Yeah, there have been tons of false messiahs that had these believers, so that doesn't really get us close to
that's where I think the resurrection and other miracles would be confirmation.
The closest thing that you got in there, I think, to what I was trying to ask is, so you think that we can confirm that Jesus performed miracles and exorcisms, and that therefore he's the Son of God?
Well, sorry.
Yeah, I understand. So is that your argument?
No, my argument is just that if Jesus did rise from the, if we have good historical grounds to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, okay, then that would be confirmation in contradistinction from other so-called messiahs. We know there were messiahs before and after Jesus, or people who claim to be messiahs, right? So if we have good historical grounds, and of course in the case of I think in the case of what we see in the Gospels as well as in Paul's writings, particularly 1 Corinthians 15, that in fact the tomb was found empty, that there were these post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, some which involved physical acts that convinced these people that he indeed had risen from the dead. In fact, every indication from the Gospels is that prior to his resurrection, in fact, when they discovered the empty tomb, the women discovered the empty tomb, and then also Peter and John, their immediate conclusion was not that he raised from the dead, but that his body was taken. So what would cause them to change their beliefs that he actually had risen? I would take it to be the post-resurrection appearances.
I would agree that that's the sequence, that it is entirely plausible, their first assumption, that the body was taken. Then they had visions or dreams that convinced them that he had risen from the dead.
Well, I don't think it was just visions. I mean, I think
Mike,
actually saw him.
forgive me, Mike, I'd like to hear from Richard.
Actually, I'm being very brief on that, but no, I want to get right back to that, because we have this from Paul, where Paul says, I did not encounter a flesh and blood person. God revealed Jesus in me.
Are you talking about Galatians 1?
Galatians 1, yeah. And Paul, nowhere in his letters ever refers to any other form of Jesus appearing to anyone, in any other fashion. He also doesn't reference an empty tomb. He says he was buried, but he skips right over the part of an empty tomb being found.
Well, I think it's implicit, right? If he was buried,
well, we don't know.
He says he was buried.
We don't know. There are lots of different, because there were Jews who believed that resurrection could be accomplished by switching to a new superior body. There are other forms of burial where maybe they don't know whether the body's in there. Once the body's interred, you might not even legally go to check to see if it's still there. There are lots of possibilities. What we don't know is what Paul believed, because he just...
Well, he does say what he believes, right? In 1 Corinthians 15.
Not about the empty tomb. That's what I'm saying. Like, he doesn't believe about the empty tomb. He doesn't mention it. He just says he was buried and then he appeared.
Right.
The only evidence that he's citing there is the appearances. No, he doesn't talk about anyone finding the empty tomb.
The problem is he goes on 1 Corinthians 15.
I mean, they might have inferred
I'd like to hear what Mike has to say just for a moment.
Yeah, he goes on to explain that the resurrection involves a transformation of the bodies, arguing for a bodily resurrection. That's pretty much, I think most New Testament scholars look at 1 Corinthians 15, and that's a pretty reasonable conclusion, reasonable interpretation to make. So if the tomb is, if he was buried and then he appears, it seems that's pretty. It seems to follow from that. This is involving bodily resurrection.
That's exactly how they could reason. If he appears to them and confirms to them that he's risen from the dead, they could infer, just like you, that the tomb must be empty. It doesn't mean there was any eyewitness to that actually having been confirmed, or that actually being the case.
The
tomb was empty. Like, we don't have any eyewitness account of the tomb ever being found empty. Even Paul doesn't.
In the Gospels.
There's no eyewitness source cited for that, so we don't know.
The women discovered an empty tomb, and so did Peter and John.
We don't have them telling us that. We have Mark telling us some women found it. We don't have it from them. We don't know what the women saw. We don't even know if those women existed.
Well, we have Matthew.
It's the same problem. Matthew is just copying Mark and embellishing on Mark.
How do you know it's embellishing? You're presuming it is.
I'm not presuming it.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, most New Testament scholars...
Matthew adds details that flatly contradict Mark.
No, it doesn't.
The women go right up to the tomb. There's no angel flying down from outer space. There are no guards that the angel paralyzes.
Just because the difference in details doesn't mean it's a contradiction, though. I mean, that's pretty...
Say, if someone were to tell you, if you were a cop and you walked into a bank after a robbery, and one person said, yeah, this guy came in here, he opened the vault, he took the bags of money and left. And the other person said, actually, that guy came in here, but the space robot flew from outer space, paralyzed some Marines that were guarding the vault, and then opened the vault and took the money. You would not think that those were two contradictory.
Right, the problem is your analogy clearly has a contradiction. But if there's differences in details, no.
These are not little details. These are fundamental details.
Again, gentlemen, we need to more one at a time. So, Mike, finish your point, and then we need a little more chance for people to develop ideas for the audience to hear. Mike,
okay. So I would submit that, in fact, I think a good percentage of New Testament scholars would see the post-resurrection narratives has, yes, there are differences, but they aren't necessarily contradictions. In the same way, if you're a police investigator and you are interviewing 4 witnesses and they tell you exactly, in exact detail, the same story, you're probably going to be suspicious. It's not uncommon for eyewitness details to differ. The question is, the only problem is if they contradict, that would be the problem. And I'm not convinced that there is a contradiction there. There are differences, sure. So I think that was...
Go ahead.
Yeah.
So is it my turn to question, right?
It is, yeah, go for it.
Okay. So, where was it at? Let me talk about Galatians 1. because you make much about this in your book, and let's take, just so for the benefit of the people here, let me just read this, and I want to make sure I represent your view accurately. Let's see here. He says, Paul, an apostle, not for men, nor through man, but through Christ Jesus and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all the brothers who were with me. Now, yeah, and then you make the point that the first verse, not for men, nor through men, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father. The problem I have is that when you continue reading this passage.
You're supposed to be at verse 11. Are you still on verse 1?
No, I'm in verse 1.
Yeah. I'm referring to when he talks about not flesh and blood.
Right. So you have to. But I'm saying, I'm talking about the fact that how did Paul receive this, right?
Oh, okay.
Okay. So clearly, in reading the flow of Paul's argument here in Galatians, and once again, I looked at 4 or 5 different commentaries on this from different perspectives. And I think almost all of them, all of them agree. What Paul's arguing for here is that he's saying, look, he's appealing to his road to Damascus experience, right?
Well, that comes from Acts. We're not entirely sure if that's what Paul ever really taught, but it's not there. There's no road to Damascus in Paul's own writings.
No, it's in the book of Acts, right?
Correct.
And most scholars believe that Paul and Luke were companions. We know that Paul and Luke were companions.
Yeah, that's not the case anymore. Most scholars believe that, but we don't really have any clear evidence that Luke was.
Well, I think a good percentage of scholars do. But anyway,
Mike, sorry, Mark, could you quickly get to your points?
Verse 11, for I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached to me is not man's gospel, for I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through revelation of Jesus Christ. So your point here, I take it, is that what it seems that you're saying is that you're extrapolating, so that applies to all of Paul's teachings. In other words, everything Paul claims is by revelation or vision or dream, and not by any sense of tradition. Am I correct here?
The way I would phrase it is, he says he didn't learn the gospel by any other means except by revelation, and he never at any point anywhere in his epistle says he got any other information by any other route.
Well, that's an argument from silence, right?
Well, but the thing is that if you're going to defend an affirmative, you need an example of Paul saying he got the information.
Right, I would go back to 1 Corinthians 15, in the language of you see.
So forgive me,
oral.
Mike, forgive me. I'd like to give Richard a little bit more time to develop his.
Actually, I can skip ahead to where he's getting at. Actually, you know from my book that the wording is identical, right? From 1 Corinthians 15 and Galatians 1.
Right. And but it's also interesting to know.
Yeah, but 1 Corinthians, it's using the exact same phrase to refer to the exact same experience. Right, which is also he says is revelation. So there's no reference, even in 1 Corinthians 15, to him having any other source.
No. In fact, most commentaries take that language to be indicative of oral tradition.
Yeah, because they're ignoring the fact that it's word for word identical between Galatians.
Lambano is a very common New Testament word. I agree.
I'm not talking about one word. I'm talking about the whole phrase. His whole introduction is identical.
No, it's not identical.
Well, it's close enough.
Well, no,
I mean, it's close enough to be peculiar.
No, but nobody.
He says that
nobody that I've seen has made that argument.
If Paul says, "I did not receive the gospel from man," and then in another book he says, "I'll tell you what I received," the obvious conclusion is to follow what Paul says. Paul says.
No, you're assuming that the word is used in a technical sense, but it's not a technical term. In that,
no, actually, you're the one who's assuming the technical.
Right. What I'm saying is that the term received and delivered is often used for oral tradition.
I'm going to take what Paul at his word. When Paul says, "I didn't receive it from man,"
no, you're assuming that you know what Paul means. I don't. But like I said,
that's what he says. He actually says that. He says, "I did not receive it from man."
Gentlemen, we are descending again. I think we're really getting to the minutiae. I can tell our audience is fatiguing a little bit. It's all right. It's all right.
But I would just submit that. If you look at the majority of New Testament scholars, and you look at Bauer, Staker, the Standard Greek Lexicon, that is clearly taken to be, and it's often used, not always, but often used, as an indication of oral tradition, which was very common.
It doesn't matter how other scholars or writers use it. What matters is what Paul said.
Right, and looking at what Paul said.
Paul himself. We can't tell Paul what he said. Paul said it. We have it.
Well, you have to make an interpretation.
Said, I'm not interpreting. I'm just reading what he says. He says, "I didn't receive it from man." How can you interpret that?
Right, and I'm saying is, but you're extrapolating from that verse to say all of Paul's teachings, none of them are based upon tradition.
No, what you're doing is the only point where Paul tells us where he gets his information, he says he didn't get it from man. And you're then adding an assumption that he must have also gotten information from other people, where Paul never says that.
But he was, well,
So if we're going to make an inference for what he means, we need to go from what Paul said.
right.
But I'm saying,
Paul said in Galatians 1, he tells us.
Right.
So what I'm saying is Galatians 1, he's talking specifically about how you receive the gospel, which, once again, most New Testament scholars associate with the road to Damascus.
But if you need
Gentlemen, I'm
evidence...
forgive me, we have a time following
we're
rush
right
now.
now.
I'm really getting into detail. I'd like to have a chance to back out and have the audience ask a few general questions about the topic. So if I could get my two mic people down here, I'd like to go ahead and shift gears. Yes, gentlemen, wake up. All right, I'd like one over here and one over there. Richard, mic up. And I'll give you another one. So this one is on. So this one appears to be yours.
Okay.
You should be on. The light's off, but it's still.
Test 1, 2, 3.
Somehow. You recruit a volunteer to go fetch something.
Do you want to round for him to drink a water?
Yeah.
About 20 minutes.
I won't take that one. No,
Okay.
Just,
I'll be like 1 or 2 minutes.
All right, technical pause.
Yeah.
So while we're waiting, I'd like to go ahead and offer a few ground rules for the microphones. We're going to have 2 people roving with mics, so if you have a question, just go ahead and raise your hand, and the microphone will come to you. As you are thinking about your question, please remember that both speakers will have the opportunity, if they wish, to respond, but they might choose not to do so. So you might want to direct your question toward one speaker or perhaps toward the other, depending on what you're curious about. Lastly, we're probably not going to have any time for statements. We have about 25 minutes or so. So we're going to want to make sure that we kind of keep things succinct as far as questions go. So go ahead and be thinking about those just for a moment, and then we'll continue. So, meanwhile, I thank you to our dedicated cameraman of more than 10 years, Raleigh Kinney, who's been faithfully taping these things event in and event out. Thank you, Raleigh. I don't know if we've ever said that on live TV. All right, so do we have any questions from the audience? Any questions at all? Just by show of hands. Any questions? We have one back here, the gentleman back here, please.
I'm not quite sure how to say this as clearly as it is in my mind, but it's interesting to me that both perspectives are based on assumptions. And the theological, I think, does allow for a more nebulous understanding of things and not making absolute factual interpretations. It's an understanding. It's got perspective. And the historical, what I've always had troubles with, and I think you were trying to push, is that where's the facts? You're still getting that information somewhere. Where's the citations? Because somewhere, especially when we start going, forget hundreds of years, thousands of years, the oral tradition, things start changing. She could say, whisper something in her ear, I whispered, it's going to evolve. And you say, well, where's the citation? Well, it started with person A, but by the time it evolved to wherever it is over 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years, who the heck knows what the original intent of that factoid was? So I understand your struggle with give me the facts. Yeah. Especially in an oral tradition, it's very difficult to actually nail down the facts if everybody's dead. And it's also difficult for a historian who wants facts to understand that guttural, it just makes sense. And sometimes sense doesn't have to have facts around it. It's just that it's a sense, it's that sixth sense. So I struggle, I like the showing the facts and understand them, but I also totally understand you don't have to have facts. It's just
Thank you.
That's not very factual.
I think we have the gist of that. Thank you very much, sir. Mike, would you like to go ahead and respond, or?
well, I think, can you hear me okay? Let's try this again.
I think there's a battery.
Test 1, 2, 3.
There's a battery issue. Matt, I'm gonna grab your mic. Matt.
Sure.
It's
I'm a horrible thing with mics.
Okay. I think this, I would argue as a philosopher that, I'm not postmodern at all. I think there's objective truth, but it's really hard sometimes to establish. And depending on the area of truth finding, so when we talk about history, for example, history is notoriously difficult. I know, my PhD, I've studied the historical relation between philosophy and theology. Fortunately, my time period was the 19th century, where people wrote things down. But even writing things down, facts require interpretation. We can talk about, just to give it a real simple example. I was just watching yesterday, I was watching a thing on the Vietnam War. Even now, we talk about what is the significance. We can agree upon certain facts that happened. We can say, for example, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. We can, but there's interesting, you get into among the historians, they'll talk about, was the reason why the U.S. withdrew because the Tet Offensive actually, from a statistical perspective, I'm not saying statistics is everything, but from a statistical perspective, we won. The Americans repulsed the North Vietnamese. But of course, there's more to be considered. And of course, so, and we'll probably, for the next, we'll be debating the significance of these events for decades. I mean, that's the nature of history, as much as, we like things to be nice and clear cut. And I would say the same thing about science. I've studied enough history of science. In fact, when I talk about science, I'll ask people, I say, how many of you believe, and I talk to scientists, I'll say, how many of you believe in phlogiston? And most of them will look at me like, what's that? Well, it was prior to Lavoisier's oxidation theory of combustion. Everybody believed in phlogiston. It was this mysterious substance. So I take it that the nature of knowledge itself is often very tricky. And whether we're talking about scientific knowledge or historical knowledge, and once again, I think Richard's position, he takes a very skeptical position about how much the historical trustworthiness is. And I understand why he comes from that position, and there are people who share that view. I'm less skeptical about those things. So I think that's kind of a key difference between the two of us on this.
Richard, do you want to respond?
Just briefly. It's my position on this is, how do we know that? So someone can say, well, I'm interpreting it this certain way, but how do you know that? And yes, one method is we need facts. We need someone to have said it, or we need to have information that confirms, yes, that is actually what he meant, or that is what they said, or that is what actually happened. The other half of that, you mentioned like the feeling aspects, like you feel it's true, as opposed to having facts. And the reason why, without having to assume naturalism or anything like that, that my skepticism can't be moved by that, is that when I step back and I look, I used to be a firm believer in Taoism because of religious experiences I had. There are the Cao Dai people who firmly believe in Victor Hugo. There's a God, and then you have Buddhists and Muslims. They all say the same things, like I feel that it's true. And all those views cancel each other out, so the feeling is not evidence enough that one is more true than the other. So we need something else to show that, oh, well, this person, when they feel it's true, it actually is true. And that's what we need to try and get at, is how do we get enough evidence to believe that that one is actually true? And that's the challenge.
I just thought of an example, maybe this is helpful for us to think about. I teach philosophy, and I talk about Plato, and what's called the Socratic problem, which is when you read Plato's early writings, and of course we notice in Plato's writings, we have a pretty good idea of when his early writings, middle writings, and later writings are. And of course, in most of his dialogues, he uses Socrates as his kind of spokesperson. Now, most scholars, I think, would agree that probably early on, Plato and Socrates, our views are probably very, very similar. Probably not identical, but very similar, but we noticed over time. Now, what's interesting is that when you read Plato, he doesn't tell you, this is, okay, here's Socrates' view, here's mine, or here's, he'll quote people, he'll quote, he'll quote Parmenides, but a lot of times you have to the historian has to sit there and kind of, okay, so let's see here, Socrates is saying that, but really is that what Socrates' view is? And so a lot, I think, and it's like when I tell my students, I say, we can't know for 100% sure this is Plato's view or this is not Socrates' view. We have to make these kind of informed ideas, and I think we can have some degree of confidence. I think when it comes to knowledge, I think the idea of certainty is kind of about the only thing I'm certain about is that I exist. I think going back to Descartes, I think therefore I am. Beyond that, I think we have to, I think I can have degrees of confidence, but I can't be absolutely certain. I could, there could be a Cartesian view. Those are possibilities. So I'm a little bit more, I think, measured. And that's why, for me, yes, there are problems in trying to evaluate the New Testament documents and evaluate their historicity, but that's not unique to the New Testament. And so that doesn't bother me as much as I think it bothers Richard.
It doesn't really bother me either.
Right.
I'm comfortable with not knowing things.
All right, another question. One in the back.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Carrier, for tonight's session. Thanks for traveling on far call. I have a brief question for both of you, separately. Dr. Gurney, when Dr. Carrier was asking for eyewitness account to the resurrection, is there a particular reason why you didn't mention John?
I could have, and probably, I think I would include John, although you realize that for a lot of New Testament scholars, not all of them, and there certainly have been some very well-credentialed New Testament scholars who defended, and I would hold to John's, that John, the Apostle John, is the author of the Gospel of John. And then his epistles, I would also take that to be John. And of course, there he says, I've seen, I've touched. So I think those are authentic, but I realize that it's a very, if one takes it, it's a very contestable view, so I wanted to kind of not get sidetracked on some of those. But I do think John, I would count John as an eyewitness.
Right, he was also one of the later written Gospels.
Right. I think pretty much we would all agree, although you had John A.T. Robinson, who's a liberal scholar, who argued that John's Gospel was written 470 AD. I don't buy that, but he's got some arguments.
And that doesn't line up with, okay. And Dr. Carrier, you threw out a long list of points, and I appreciate your approach. One of the sub-points that I think you brought up, and I want to make sure that I heard it correctly, did you, I'll say it back to that's what I know how. Did you assume that the Gospels were written before 70 AD, but they were written long enough after the death and resurrection of Christ that they were no longer really historically valid since they were written at least 30, 40 years late? Did I understand that correctly?
No, I adopt the mainstream view, which is that the Gospels started to be written after 70 AD, and we don't really have a really tight window as to when they were finished being written by 140 AD at the latest. So somewhere between the 70s and the 130s AD is when the Gospels get written, which is, it's quite a long time after the events.
Okay, so you feel that the Gospels were generally written by additional folks post the fall of Jerusalem, so post 70.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Then the rest of my question.
Okay.
Mike, any comments?
Yeah, I don't think I wouldn't say it. It's hard to say whether a mainstream view. I would say that clearly there are a significant number of New Testament scholars who would see it earlier than that time. Certainly, like I said, the problem is in New Testament scholarship, there's a pretty wide range. If you look at the Jesus Seminar, they're going to push it more towards into the 1st century, 2nd century. But I would say there's a pretty significant number, and I'm not talking about just evangelicals, I'm talking about pretty well-respected New Testament scholars that are mainstream who would push it closer, in the 50s, 60s. So, especially with Mark, I've seen a number of scholars who are not, like I said, not evangelical, who have argued for that. So, I think that's like I said, that's part of the problem when you deal with New Testament scholarship. There's a pretty wide range, a lot of diversity, which makes it hard to I think, that's why I'm sympathetic to your proving history book, that, it's like, you want something to nail these things down more. And frankly, for me, a lot of this goes back to one of the key presumptions. I mean, up until Spinoza, 17th century, nobody questions the Gospels, nobody questions the New Testament. And I'm not saying that makes it right, that their view is right. What I'm saying is I think that reveals that how much, because of Spinoza, his rejection of miracles, any kind of supernatural miracles. Well, once you grant that premise, then that's why I think a lot of scholars who grant naturalism, of course they're going to have they're going to look at the Gospels as much later. They're going to be very skeptical about the miracles of Jesus. They're going to be very skeptical about the exorcism of Jesus. They're going to be very skeptical about the resurrection. But once again, the question, especially as a philosopher, I say, but why think naturalism is true? I think there are significant problems with naturalism. In fact, Tom Nagel, a very well-known philosopher who's an atheist, has come out in his book Cosmos and Mind and argued we cannot explain consciousness, and he's not alone in saying that. John Searle has talked about this. Colin McGinn said he calls it a mystery. So I think naturalism is far from proven as a premise, and that's why I said I'm not saying there are no natural, probabilities on that. I'm just saying we can't just presume that, and I think it doesn't. I'm reading Richard's book. I mean, I had to rush through it, but I looked for that pretty carefully, and I thought a lot of his probability calculations were predicated on the improbabilities of non-natural events.
Richard, did you have a quick response before we proceed?
Yeah, because all religions make miracle claims. We don't need naturalism to be skeptical of miracle claims. And when you assign a probability to something, the frequency of how claims turn out, whether they turn out to be naturally explained or false versus actual supernatural events, that necessarily entails there's a non-zero probability that it was actually a supernatural event. So I'm actually not presuming naturalism in any of my probability calculations in proving history. All I point to in there is what usually turns out to be the case when we look at something like this. When we have these kinds of claims, when we look at what happens when they get investigated properly, or you're able to investigate them properly, and what happens. So far, every single time that's ever happened, the supernatural claim dissolves. Now that's the case even if some supernatural claims are true. But what that means is most supernatural claims by far are false, even if supernatural things actually do happen. And this is the epistemic conclusion you have to reach, even if you're a supernaturalist. So naturalism is not even relevant to that conclusion.
All right, let's have another question, please.
You both spoke about the time period between the death of Jesus and the writing of the Gospels. I'd like to back up, though. What about oral traditions that never made it into the Gospels? What about the editing process, if you will, to make your book?
Well, certainly we know that there was, the Gospels were redacted, there was editing going on. The question is, was there authentic information or historical information that was edited out? Well, we do know, I mean, we can't, like I said, we got to be careful with arguments from silence, but I think certainly we do have documents, like the Gospel of Thomas, we have other ones that are written later, that and once again, there's debate about when exactly some of these, attest the fact that there are diverse stories going around. But I don't think we can just presume that there was this intentional suppression of true material or genuine historical material. You would have to, unless we find some kind of documentation. What we do have in terms of documentation of these later Gospels indicate Gnostic influence. They don't, and for example, probably the best example, the Gospel of Thomas, well, it shows dependence upon the Synoptic Gospels. So, I think, what if questions, I think, are very hard to answer because we know that there was oral tradition. I mean, the Jewish culture is a very oral culture. So there's no question a lot of this was oral transmitted. We look at the Gospels, we see that a lot of the pericopes, the little sections of the Gospels, were well designed for oral memorization. So there's been a lot of scholarship has gone into that. There's certain theories about that. But I think once again, or all the indications we have of some of these alternative gospels appear to be much later and have no real. It's hard to find any kind of historical grounding in them that would make them superior to the canonical gospels in any way.
I'm not thinking necessarily that
actually, I know exactly what you're thinking. That was a brilliant question. It threw me for a moment, because I thought you were going where he went, which is, what about stuff outside? No, you mean things that got deleted.
Yes.
It's just that we don't get to see them today at all.
Yes. Yes.
And that's a really good point. I hadn't even thought of that. And so I was, while this was going on and I was listening to him, I was thinking, like, what's an example of that? So it actually ties to something came up in the debate. The difference between Mark and Matthew and the empty tomb. And Matthew adds, so Mark has this story where the women go to the tomb and there's some guy there who explains to them that the body's gone, and they see the body's gone, and then they run away. And Mark actually ends by saying they don't tell anybody, but that's a whole other debate. But Matthew adds that, and women go there, and there are actually these guards that were placed there, but they're not there in Mark. And this angel comes down from outer space and then zaps them, and they're paralyzed, and then sits on top of the tomb, opens the tomb, sits on top of the tomb, and explains to the women, oh, Jesus isn't here. I guess when Jesus left, he was polite enough to put the tombstone back on, so the angel could move it. But the interesting thing here is that then there's a conversation, right? That the guards then run and tell the Sanhedrin and say, oh, like, and there's a secret conversation going on, and say, like, this thing happened, what do we do? And they say, well, you just claim that you slept and they stole the body while you slept, and we will bribe some officials to believe that, or we'll let you get off the hook for that, or whatever. Okay, so if you're looking at someone who wants to tell this story, let's suppose something actually happened. Let's suppose that, in fact, what the guards originally said is actually what happened. That they fell asleep, somebody came and stole the body. Not necessarily the disciples. There's a variety of different suspects. I have a whole chapter on this in a book that I wrote. And then, of course, well, then what do you do? If you're gonna, like, you can't have this story. So you make up this other story where you have, like, oh, well, this guards, they lied. Now, if you notice in Matthew, they have this whole conversation between the guards and the Sanhedrin about this conspiracy to lie about it. What's his source for that? Who was present to that conversation? It's clearly fiction. There's no way he would have ever known that conversation occurred. He's making it up. And he's making it up to explain away this, you might think, this other story that, oh shit, the body was stolen. So this is an example of where the truth gets deleted and then something gets added on and has radically transformed the information that we get access to. Now, I'm not saying that that's what happened, but it is a possibility of what happened. How do we rule it out? It's really hard to do when they're policing all the data that gets to us, altering it, taking things away, and putting things in, that hugely kind of destroys the evidence and our access to it. And this is a big problem. Now, in history, we're comfortable with this, because there's lots of things we don't know. We could be, maybe, maybe not. We're fine with that. But if you're going to make a claim that Jesus is the Son of God, maybe, maybe not is not going to cut it for that, right? So that's a much harder task to prove than most things that we are challenged with in ancient history. But I assume that's what you're getting at.
Yeah.
So okay.
Mike, did you want to respond to the question that's been changed?
Yeah. Now that, do you see what she's saying?
I think just, yeah.
She's talking about information that got lost.
Right.
Yeah.
But of course that assumes a lot. I mean, you're assuming several things that Matthew was lying, that there was misinformation.
Oh, I mean, don't focus on my example so much.
No, but I'm saying,
question.
the problem is we don't know, so I don't think we can just assume. And I think, once again, most historians, I think there's a principle called the principle of charity that unless there's evidence to the contrary, you assume that they're being truthful. If we don't, much of what we claim to be historical knowledge would be questioned. Do people lie? Yes, they do. But unless we have good reason to believe that they are, so for example, what if somebody did steal Jesus' body? So what would then, if that was the case, especially given the predisposition of the disciples upon discovering the empty tomb, they wouldn't conclude resurrection. They would say his body's gone. It wasn't until the post-resurrection appearances that they said, oh, okay, he's alive. Because remember, they didn't discover the empty tomb. They didn't say he's alive. They said, where's his body? See, so to me, yeah, is it possible there was, and once again, like I said, we know there was all sorts of oral traditions, and some of those that have been written down, we have them, and the problem is all of them are much later. All of them show are in fact, some of them are quite fascinating in some of their graphic details and just kind of elaborate story making. I mean, a lot of scholars and historians have pointed out that the Gospels themselves are amazingly reserved in how they describe these events. They don't go into a lot of detail. They don't go into a lot of fanciful speculations. In reference to the angels appearing, well, that's pretty common in the scriptures. Angels oftentimes are used as messengers. So I don't think that's not inconsistent. That's actually fairly consistent. But once again, that's not a problem if you hold that there's a God, then we're not surprised that there are angels. That's a pretty consistent element of what we see in the scriptures. In fact, what's interesting, when you look at the scriptures, the canonical scriptures, how they describe the angels is actually fairly reserved compared to, say, some of the Gnostic Gospels or some of the medieval literature, where you get some pretty fanciful stories about various angels. So, anyway.
Thank you, Mike. Well, we have run out of time. I can't believe 3 questions and we had all that material to respond.
Good question.
We have a few minutes remaining, and the speakers are going to offer 2-minute statements, and I will make you stick to that, both of you. 2 minutes for closing statements. So we can go ahead and get a sense of what we've just heard today. So Richard, will begin with you. You can offer 2 minutes of closing statements, and then Mike, you'll close with your own 2-minute statement.
Okay, yeah. We'll just start with the issue that we haven't actually established in this debate any evidence that gods exist and that they intervene in the world. So we didn't get that established, and we need that to be established before we can build on it to get the Son of God. I've made an extensive case, presented a lot of examples of where I think the evidence is not what we expect if the proposition is true. But the evidence fits exactly what we would expect there to be if the proposition was false. And that's always where it's going to hinge. So even where he's disputing it, you got to look at what things he said that we're trying to challenge that. And then that's the thing you should go further, take away from this debate, and go explore those things further. So, obviously we're not going to answer this question in this one debate. You can't answer any question in one debate. But you've got all these 2 sides. Now you can go and compare and say, well, okay, what evidence do we expect if the proposition is true that would not be there if it was false? Can you find any of that? And then the same thing goes the other way around, like what if the evidence is kind of what we expect? Is it actually kind of what we'd expect if it was false? So you can explore all of these questions further, and I think that's where the direction of your inquiry has to go, even assuming you've solved the first problem, which is whether there are gods that intervene in the world. And the basic gist of my case was that we just had these visions. Paul even says he doesn't refer to any other form of information anybody had that confirmed the divinity of Jesus other than visions, and that also led them to read things out of the scriptures. And that's the kind of thing that we see in religions all over the place, coming to various different conclusions, even that Victor Hugo is a god, for example. So that information is not enough to establish that this one is a real god, as opposed to the other gods. All the evidence looks like that, like an ordinary religion, in the same way all religions would originate. Just a few people who were already motivated to believe in one particular place at one particular time, rather than something that's actually evidence of something actually divine, which would be like a God who could speak to everyone on earth at the same time. Like that would be certainly superhuman, would well establish that. And that's something that could have been confirmed in historical evidence. We could have verifiable records in China in 33 AD of Jesus appearing in all the temples there and explaining the gospel to them. We would be having a very different debate here if that were the case. Which gets us to the question of why wouldn't a God do that? Who wants people to believe this proposition? Who needs people to believe this proposition to save them? This is the lifesaver he's throwing people. And so that's really my position. And you've heard all the other aspects of this, and this might get up on YouTube so you can go back and review what we've said in the beginning.
All right, Mike, 2 minutes.
Okay, 2 points. First of all, I totally agree with Richard on the point that if there is no God, then the Son of God is really delusional. Of course, the problem is our debate tonight was not on arguments for God's existence. But let me just put forth a really quick point, I think. If there is a God, then the fundamental laws of nature are not determinative. That is, exceptions are possible and plausible. If there is no God, then the fundamental laws are determinative with no exceptions. And here I would challenge Richard. I wish we had time to be able to dialogue afterwards. But if these fundamental natural laws are determinative, then human beliefs and desires likewise are determined by nature, and there are no human volitions, except those determined by the laws of chemistry and physics. So I think that there are reasons why I think one can make an argument there for God's existence from that. The second point, and I'm going to quote C.S. Lewis, who of course is well known for his work as a literary professor. That's really what he does, more than an apologist. And he addresses this question in his book, his essay, Myth Become Fact. So I'm just going to quote this. He says, "Now as myth transcends thought, incarnation transcends myth. The heart of Christianity is a myth, which is also a fact. The old myth of the dying God, without ceasing to be myth, comes down from heaven, the heaven of legend and imagination, to the heart of history. It happens at a particular date in a particular place, followed by definable historical consequences. We pass from a Balder or an Osiris, dying nobody knows when or where, to a historical person crucified. It is all in order under Pontius Pilate. By becoming fact, it does not cease to be myth. That is the miracle." And I would submit that the reason why there's these similarities is, could it not be the case that that these myths are ways to prepare? As Justin Martyr himself argued, that he saw Plato as a prophet to the Gentiles, that these myths are reflections of human yearnings and desires that are best satisfied by the true gospel, which is myth become fact.
All right, a round of applause, please, for these speakers. All right, thank you everyone for your patience and for attending today. We appreciate your support. If you'd like to talk with our Socratics, they're right over here, and I can see that they're all ready to go. Have a good night.
Wow.